When we think of colonialism, our minds often drift to soldiers, ships, plantations, and railroads. But one of the most powerful and lasting tools of empire was not built with bricks or rifles. It was built with chalk, slates, and textbooks. Education under colonial rule was never a neutral enterprise. It was designed, structured, and enforced to serve the needs of the colonizers, not the colonized. Today, we'll explore colonial education systems through 4 central questions. What was education like under colonial rule? How did colonizers use schools to control minds? Why did colonial curriculums erase indigenous knowledge? And finally, what legacy did British and French education systems leave behind in Africa and Asia? The earliest formal schools in colonized regions were founded by missionaries. In Latin America, Jesuit schools emerged as early as the 1500s. Portuguese missionaries opened schools in coastal West Africa, while Catholic orders ran schools in the Philippines. Their goals were clear: literacy tied to Christian scripture, moral discipline, and conversion. By the 19th century, missionary schools were widespread in Africa and Asia. The Church Missionary Society, founded in 1799, built schools in Nigeria and Sierra Leone. The Paris Evangelical Missionary Society did the same in French colonies. These schools introduced Western literacy, but also tied education to Christianization, setting the stage for colonial governments to later adopt and expand these systems. By the early 1800s, colonial powers began to formalize education as state policy. In British India, Governor-General Lord William Bentinck supported Thomas Babington Macaulay's famous Minute on Indian Education in 1835. Macaulay dismissed traditional Sanskrit and Persian schools, declaring European knowledge intrinsically superior. He wrote that colonial education should produce a class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, opinions, morals, and in intellect. This statement crystallized the British approach, creating English-speaking elite to serve as clerks, judges, and administrators. By the 1850s, universities were established in Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras, designed to teach English literature, British law, and Western science. The Woods Dispatch of 1854, often called the Magna Carta of English education in India, expanded this policy, recommending government support for schools and emphasizing the training of Indians for subordinate administrative posts. France, meanwhile, pursued a different model in West Africa. The policy of assimilation, especially after the 1880s, aimed to turn Africans into black Frenchmen. Schools in places like Senegal, Cité d'Ivoire, and Dahomey taught French history, language, and civic values. By the early 20th century, the famous school in Gorée, Senegal, produced African elites who were steeped in French culture. Yet the reach was tiny. By 1914, fewer than 2% of African children were in school. Portugal was even slower. In Angola and Mozambique, education was neglected until the 20th century. Only a handful of mission schools existed, and very few Africans could access them. The numbers reveal the inequality. In 1901, only about 0.6% of children in French West Africa attended school. In British East Africa, missionary schools taught a few thousand children out of millions. Even in India, despite the larger network, literacy rates in 1911 were just at 6%. Gender inequality was stark. Colonial education prioritized boys for government or clerical roles. Girls' schooling, where it existed, often focused on domestic training. For example, missionary schools in Nigeria taught girls sewing, cooking, and catechism rather than higher subjects. This reflected both European gender norms and colonial assumptions about African and Asian societies. Language policy was at the heart of colonial education. In India, Macaulay's insistence on English created a sharp divide. Those who mastered English gained access to jobs and status, while the majority who spoke only vernacular languages were excluded. In French Africa, the exclusive use of French meant that local languages were pushed to the margins. Students who failed to adopt French were effectively locked out of education. By the 1930s, French officials boasted of producing Africans who could recite Rousseau, but knew nothing of their own ancestral kingdoms. This reliance on European languages created what Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the Kenyan novelist, later called the colonization of the mind. It wasn't just about vocabulary, but it reshaped how people thought, what knowledge was valued, and what identities were seen as legitimate. Colonial classrooms taught an education that glorified Europe while marginalizing local traditions. In British India, students read Shakespeare, Milton, and Wordsworth, while Sanskrit epics like the Mahabharata or Persian poetry were left out. In Nigeria, textbooks described Britain as the mother country, teaching African children loyalty to the crown. In French Africa, pupils learned about Joan of Arc, the French Revolution, and Voltaire, but not about Sundiata Keita, the founder of the Mali Empire. This Eurocentric curriculum was not accidental. It instilled admiration for Europe, creating cultural dependency and delegitimizing indigenous heritage. By stripping local history from the classroom, colonial powers undermined collective memory. Education was never about mass enlightenment. It was about governance. Colonial authorities calculated that a completely uneducated population would be hard to manage. But too much education might breed dissent, so they carefully limited access, creating a small group of literate intermediaries. These men, clerks, teachers, and minor officials, became the bridge between colonial rulers and ordinary people. They translated, filed reports, and ran schools. The British called them Babas in India. In French Africa, they were évalués, Africans trained to mimic French ways. But this strategy carried a hidden danger. By exposing colonized elites to European political philosophy, Locke, Rousseau, Montesquieu, colonial schools unwittingly planted seeds of rebellion. By the early 20th century, these educated Africans and Asians began to turn Europe's own ideals of liberty and democracy against colonialism. Like we said earlier, colonial approaches differed across empires and regions. Britain had its indirect rule, reliance on missionaries, focus on producing clerks and administrators. Policies like Wood's Dispatch and Macaulay's Minute guided education in India. Whilst in France, assimilation policy, centralized curriculum, and focusing on producing French Africans. The Blaise Diagne reforms granted limited citizenship rights to educated Africans from the 4 communes of Senegal. In Portugal, it was neglect until late 19th to the early 20th century. Most Africans excluded. For the Dutch, they had the dual-track education, elite schools for Javanese nobility, and vocational schools for commoners. By 1907, the ethical policy introduced some reforms but reinforced social stratification. In Japan, Korea, and Taiwan, Japanese language became compulsory. Korean history was erased, and students were forced to adopt Japanese names. By the mid-20th century, as independence movements spread, it was clear that colonial education had backfired. Leaders of anti-colonial resistance, Jawaharlal Nehru and B.R. Ambedkar in India, Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Leopold Senghor in Senegal, Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, were all products of colonial schools or universities. They used the tools of European thought law and political theory to challenge the legitimacy of the empire itself. The paradox was stark. Colonial classrooms were designed to produce obedient servants of empire, but they ended up training its critics. So what was education like under colonial rule? It was exclusive, Eurocentric, language-driven, and designed for control. It erased indigenous knowledge while creating a small, loyal elite. Yet in trying to control minds, colonial education also gave birth to the very generation that would demand freedom. This sets the stage for the deeper question: how did colonizers deliberately use schools as instruments of control, and why did their curriculums erase indigenous knowledge? By the late 19th century, colonial powers had realized that schools were more than just classrooms. They were powerful laboratories of empires. Colonial education was never neutral. It was political, cultural, and psychological. The logic was simple. Soldiers and administrators could dominate bodies, but education could dominate minds. In British India, this strategy became visible after the Indian Rebellion of 1857. The uprising shook the East India Company and convinced the British Crown, which took direct control in 1858, that education could be used to civilize and pacify. Schools after 1858 emphasized loyalty to the Crown, Christian values, and English instruction. By 1882, the Hunter Commission on Education reaffirmed that mass education was unnecessary, but a loyal clerical class was vital. In French Africa, the assimilation policy was codified in the early 20th century. Schools in the 4 communes of Senegal, Dakar, Gorée, St. Louis, Rufisque, taught French citizenship and civic duty. Africans who completed this education could, under the Blaise Diagne reforms of 1916, claim limited French citizenship. But this was the exception, not the rule. Most Africans were educated just enough to be useful, not enough to demand equality. Historians described a hidden curriculum, which was the unspoken lessons that shaped colonial students. Beyond reading and writing, schools taught European superiority. A child in Lagos might learn about Napoleon, but nothing about the Oyo Empire. Harsh discipline and rote memorization instilled habits of submission. Wearing European uniforms, saluting colonial flags, or reciting European prayers sent the message that local traditions were lesser. What about assimilation as progress? Mastery of English or French opened doors, whilst clinging to indigenous languages closed them. One Nigerian student in the 1930s remembered being beaten for speaking Yoruba in class, while another recalled that textbooks described Africa as a dark continent that needed saving. These small lessons reinforced the larger system of control. Perhaps the most insidious feature of colonial education was the systematic erasure of indigenous knowledge. This was not neglect, it was a deliberate policy. In Africa, agricultural schools promoted European farming methods unsuited to tropical climates, while dismissing local techniques honed over centuries. In India, traditional medical systems like Ayurveda and Unani were sidelined as unscientific, even though many British scientists quietly studied their remedies. In Kenya, schools taught that Mount Kenya had no meaning beyond geography, ignoring its sacred role in Kikuyu cosmology. Even history was rewritten. The Cambridge School Histories, widely used in British colonies from the 1900s onward, portrayed Africa as a land of tribes without states or achievements until Europeans arrived. In French schools, history lessons glorified the French Revolution while ignoring the great empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. By controlling the past, colonial education shaped how colonized people imagined their future. British India, policies like Macaulay's Minute and Wood's Dispatch created a narrow English-educated elite. These men, later dubbed Brown Sahibs, worked as clerks, translators, and teachers. But they also became critics. Leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru, educated at Harrow and Cambridge, and B.R. Ambedkar, who studied at Columbia, and the London School of Economics used their colonial education to fight for independence. French West Africa. Here, the assimilation policy aimed to erase African identities. Schools taught French citizenship, but only to a small elite. By 1938, fewer than 50,000 African children were in French schools out of tens of millions. And yet, figures like Leopold Sedar Senghor, a graduate of colonial schools and later a poet-president of Senegal, turned the very tools of French education into a philosophy of origin, celebrating African identity against colonial erasure. In Nigeria and Ghana, missionary societies like the Church Missionary Society and Wesleyan Missions ran most schools. But colonial governors limited higher education. Lord Lugard, the architect of indirect rule, argued in 1922 that too much education would unfit Africans for their proper station. Yet graduates of Akimoto School in Ghana and Fora Bay College in Sierra Leone became key leaders in Pan-African movements. The Dutch introduced the ethical policy, which expanded education for Indonesians, but it created a stark divide. Elite schools for the children of aristocrats, and lower-quality village schools for commoners. This system trained a tiny elite like Sukarno, who later led Indonesia's independence but kept most Indonesians excluded. After annexing Korea in 1910, Japan imposed education policies that forced Korean students to adopt Japanese names and language. By the 1930s, history textbooks erased Korean history entirely, replacing it with the story of the Japanese emperor. Although resistance emerged in night schools, where Koreans secretly taught their children their own culture and history, the paradox was that colonial education produced the very leaders who dismantled colonialism. By the early 20th century, the educated elite, trained to admire European ideas, began to use those ideas against the colonizers, with the likes of Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, Ho Chi Minh, and Mahatma Gandhi all played a deep role in fighting for independence and legitimacy. Colonial education, intended as a tool of control, inadvertently created a generation that understood law, politics, and ideology well enough to challenge empire. Even after independence, colonial education systems left lasting marks. For example, English remains the language of universities and courts in India, Nigeria, and Kenya, all whilst French dominates in West Africa. This grants access to global opportunities, but sidelines indigenous languages. Many post-colonial schools still rely on Eurocentric syllabi. Students in Ghana might still study European medieval history more than African empires. As for inequality, just as colonial schools privileged urban over rural areas, modern education systems often reproduce the same divides. Attempts to decolonize education began in the mid-20th century. Julius Nyerere's Education for Self-Reliance policy in Tanzania aimed to reorient schools toward African needs, emphasizing agriculture, self-sufficiency, and Swahili language. In India, reforms after independence expanded vernacular education, but English retained its prestige. So how did colonizers use schools to control minds? They used language as a gatekeeper, erased indigenous knowledge, rewrote history, and created a loyal elite. But in doing so, they also sowed the seeds of resistance. The irony of colonial education is that it was designed to produce servants of empire, but ended up training its most formidable critics. From Makila in 1835 to Nyerere in 1967, the story of colonial education is one of domination, erasure, and eventual resistance. If you enjoyed watching this video, please leave a like, share, and comment your thoughts on this. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.